It is the middle of the night, December 1941, somewhere in the Libyan desert. A German sentry at Sirte airfield lights a cigarette. Behind him, in neat rows under the stars, sit dozens of Luftwaffe bombers and fighters, the planes that have been strafing British convoys, bombing Tobruk, and clearing the sky for Rommel's tanks. The airfield is quiet. Guarded, but quiet. What the sentry does not know is that 4 men are already inside the perimeter. They did not fly in. They did not storm the gate. They walked in, on foot, out of a desert so empty that no one thought an enemy could survive in it, let alone attack from it. In their hands, small canvas bags. Inside those bags, bombs the size of a fist. Within the hour, this airfield, one of the most heavily defended positions in North Africa, will be burning. And the men who did it will already be gone, vanished back into the dunes, in a truck that shouldn't have been able to find them in 1,000 square miles of nothing. This is the story of the SAS, before it was famous, before it had a reputation, when it was just a handful of soldiers nobody in the British Army wanted, led by a man everyone thought was reckless. This is the story of how a unit smaller than a single company destroyed more enemy aircraft than most air forces did in a year, and did it almost entirely on foot, in the dark, with matchbox-sized bombs. To understand why this handful of men mattered so much, you have to understand what North Africa looked like in late 1941. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had pushed the British back across Libya twice already. His Afrika Corps was outmaneuvering larger Allied forces again and again, and one of the biggest reasons was air power. German and Italian aircraft, operating from a chain of airfields along the coast, owned the sky. They struck British supply convoys before they reached the front. They bombed ports. They gave Rommel's tank columns cover that Allied forces on the ground simply couldn't match. Britain's answer, on paper, should have been the Royal Air Force. But the RAF was stretched thin, badly outnumbered, and losing planes faster than it could replace them. Bombing raids on these airfields from the air were costly and often ineffective. Flak and fighter cover made every mission a gamble. So someone asked a different question. What if you didn't attack these airfields from the air at all? What if you attacked them from the ground, at night, on foot, using stealth instead of firepower? What if a tiny team could do more damage in 20 minutes with explosives than a squadron of bombers could do in a full raid? It sounded absurd. It came from a young officer nobody expected to be right. His name was David Stirling. 25 years old, a Scottish Guards officer, 6'6", and by his own admission not a natural soldier. He'd been reprimanded more than once for insubordination and had barely scraped through officer training. He wasn't a star. He was, by most accounts, a bit of a mess. But Stirling had an idea that his superiors didn't. While recovering in a Cairo hospital after a parachute training accident that left him partially paralyzed for months, he sketched out a plan: small teams of highly trained men, dropped or driven deep behind enemy lines, to attack the most valuable targets the Axis had, not tanks, not troops, but aircraft sitting undefended on the ground. The logic was simple and brutal. A fighter plane in the air is one of the hardest things in the world to destroy. A fighter plane parked on a runway at 2 a.m. is one of the easiest. Blow it up before it ever takes off, and you've achieved in seconds what an entire dogfight might not. The problem was getting anyone to listen. Stirling, still on crutches, couldn't walk into headquarters and pitch this to a general. So the story, and it's a story the SAS still tells, is that he snuck onto the base at British Middle East headquarters in Cairo, hobbled past the guards, and more or less cornered the Deputy Commander-in-Chief, General Neil Ritchie, to make his case directly. It worked. Stirling got permission to recruit just 66 men. He called this new unit, L Detachment, Special Air Service, a name deliberately invented to trick German intelligence into thinking Britain already had a full airborne division in North Africa. There was no such division. There were 66 men, no vehicles of their own, and no proof any of this would work. Here is the part of the story most people skip, because it makes the SAS look less like heroes and more like a unit that nearly got cancelled before it began. In November 1941, Stirling's men attempted their first mission, parachuting at night into the desert to attack airfields near Gazala and Tmimi, timed to support the launch of Operation Crusader. It went wrong almost immediately. A ferocious desert storm hit during the drop, wind so strong that men were dragged across rock and sand under their parachutes, injured on landing, and scattered miles from each other and from their equipment. Of the roughly 60 men who jumped that night, only 22 made it back. Weapons were lost. Supplies were lost. Several men were captured. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe, the kind of failure that gets a fledgling unit shut down before it fires a shot in anger. Stirling refused to let that happen. He went back to headquarters and argued that the failure wasn't the concept, it was the method. Parachuting blind into a storm was the mistake, not ground raiding itself. He proposed a fix: instead of dropping in from the air, his men would be driven in, dropped off far from the target by the long-range desert group, a separate unit of expert desert navigators who could cross hundreds of miles of open sand with uncanny accuracy, and picked up again after the raid. It was a gamble on a unit that had just suffered an almost total loss. But headquarters, desperate for anything that could slow Rommel down, said yes. The revised plan was almost embarrassingly simple, which is exactly why it worked. The long-range desert group would drive Stirling's raiders deep into the desert, navigating by sun compass and stars across terrain with no roads, no landmarks, nothing but sand, a skill so precise these navigators could deliver a team within a few hundred meters of a target after a 200-mile drive. From a drop-off point miles from the airfield, the SAS men would go the rest of the way on foot, in the dark, often crawling the final stretch to get past sentries and perimeter patrols. Each man carried a small haversack of what became the raid's signature weapon, the Lewes bomb. Named after one of the unit's own founding officers, Jock Lewes, it was a simple, ingenious device, a mix of plastic explosive, thermite, and oil, small enough to fit in your palm, but powerful enough to set fire to an aircraft's fuel tanks the moment it detonated. A raider could carry a dozen or more of these in a single bag. The method: slip through the airfield perimeter in the dark, move from aircraft to aircraft, clip a bomb with a time delay fuse onto each one, and disappear before the first explosion, time to allow the whole team to be well clear before the airfield lit up behind them. It required nerve most soldiers never have to test. Walking, unarmed in any meaningful sense, past armed sentries, guard dogs, and patrols, close enough to touch the aircraft you're about to destroy, trusting that darkness and audacity were better protection than any weapon. And it worked. Not once, again and again. Through December 1941, small teams of SAS raiders hit airfields at Sirte, Ajdabiya, and other Axis bases along the Libyan coast. Night after night, they slipped past defenses that had never considered the idea of an enemy on foot appearing from the empty desert to the south, because to the Germans and Italians manning those airfields, that direction was simply not a threat. The Sahara was the wall protecting their backs. That assumption was the SAS's greatest weapon. At more than one airfield, raiders moved down entire rows of parked aircraft in the space of 20 or 30 minutes, planting bombs on plane after plane, then withdrew into the dark before the first charge detonated. By the time the fires started, the SAS men were already miles away, moving toward a rendezvous point with the long-range desert group trucks that would carry them back across the desert to safety. In one of these December raids alone, roughly 60 enemy aircraft were destroyed on the ground, in a single night, by a team that could be counted on two hands. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Every one of those aircraft represented hours of manufacturing, trained aircrew, fuel, spare parts, and, critically, air cover that Rommel's forces would not have the next morning. The RAF, with far greater resources, was struggling to achieve comparable results through conventional bombing raids, at far higher cost and far higher risk to aircrew. Stirling's absurd idea, that a few men with fist-sized bombs could outperform bomber squadrons, was no longer absurd. It was working. If one raid defines this campaign, it's the attack on Sidi Haneish airfield in July 1942, by which point the unit had grown, refined its methods, and become bold enough to try something even more audacious than sneaking in on foot. By mid-1942, the SAS had access to American-made jeeps, stripped down and mounted with multiple machine guns, sometimes as many as 4 per vehicle. At Sidi Haneish, instead of a quiet foot infiltration, Stirling planned something closer to a cavalry charge. A column of these armed jeeps would drive directly onto the airfield at night in tight formation and simply shoot up every aircraft in sight while driving through the base at speed. It should not have worked. It was loud, direct, and gave up the element of stealth entirely. But it relied on speed, surprise, and sheer audacity, the idea that no defender would expect an attack that bold, that fast, in the middle of the night. The jeeps roared onto the airfield in formation, guns blazing down both sides of the parked aircraft. In the chaos and gunfire, German and Italian ground crews barely had time to reach for their own weapons before the column had already torn through the base. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed or badly damaged in minutes, and the raiders were gone again before any organized defense could form. It was reckless. It was also devastatingly effective, proof that this small unit wasn't just clever, it was capable of adapting its methods entirely and still winning. This is not a story where everything went perfectly, and it shouldn't be told that way. Raiders were captured. Some were executed under Hitler's infamous 1942 Commando Order, which stripped captured commandos of prisoner-of-war protections, a war crime that made every mission for these men a mission with no safety net if things went wrong. Vehicles broke down in the open desert, sometimes stranding men hundreds of miles from help. Navigation errors, mechanical failure, and enemy patrols killed raiders on missions that never made it into the official tally of successful operations. One of the men at the center of many of these raids was Paddy Mayne, an Irish rugby international turned SAS officer, who by most accounts personally destroyed more enemy aircraft with his own hands than almost any pilot on either side managed to shoot down in the air. Mayne was fearless to the point of recklessness, difficult, and, by the accounts of the men who served with him, utterly relentless once inside an enemy airfield. He would eventually take command of the unit itself. The point isn't to lionize this without nuance. It's to be honest, this campaign worked because a small number of men were willing to accept extraordinary risk, night after night, with no guarantee any single mission would end with them coming home. By the time the North African campaign turned decisively against Rommel in late 1942, the SAS and its raiding partners had destroyed an estimated several hundred enemy aircraft on the ground. Some accounts place the total for this early desert period at over 300 planes, along with fuel dumps, vehicle depots, and supply lines struck in the same string of raids. To put that in perspective, that is a number of aircraft comparable to the losses of a major air battle, achieved not by fighter pilots in dogfights, but by a unit that at its founding numbered barely 60 men, using bombs you could carry in a jacket pocket. Rommel himself is reported to have taken the threat seriously enough to divert resources toward rear-area security, troops, patrols, and defenses that could otherwise have reinforced his front line. Every sentry posted to guard an airfield against a raid that might never come was a soldier not available for the fight against Montgomery's 8th Army. The SAS didn't just destroy planes. They forced Rommel to fight a war on two fronts at once, one in front of him, and one behind him, in the dark, that he could never quite locate or stop. What began as 66 men that almost nobody in British High Command believed in became the template for modern special forces around the world. The core ideas Stirling and his men proved in the Libyan desert, small teams, deep infiltration, precision sabotage over brute force, audacity as a substitute for numbers, are still the foundation of special operations doctrine today. The SAS motto, adopted in these early years, is "Who dares wins." It's easy to treat that as a slogan. It's harder, and more accurate, to see it as a literal description of what happened at Sirte, at Ajdabiya, at Sidi Haneish, a small number of men who dared to do something no army had organized around before, and who won, repeatedly, against odds that should have crushed them. David Stirling himself was eventually captured in early 1943 and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, including time at Colditz Castle, the high-security prison for persistent escapees. He never got to see the full scale of what the unit he founded would become. But the men he trained, Paddy Mayne among them, carried the SAS forward through the rest of the war and into the decades after. Rommel's airfields were among the most heavily defended positions in North Africa, guarded, patrolled, and protected by an empty ocean of desert that no one believed an enemy could cross on foot. They were wrong. A small unit of men proved that the most dangerous weapon in the desert wasn't a tank or a bomber. It was a handful of soldiers willing to walk into the impossible, in the dark, and do what everyone else assumed could not be done. That is the story of the men who destroyed Rommel's airfields, not from the air, but on the ground, one bomb at a time.